I want to talk about change in a competitive educational landscape. And we will begin by looking at changing demographics more broadly in society at large. One of the big issues is the regional differences. So if you look at this graphic, you can see the decrease of 5% or more, decrease of less than 5, and then the increase. So the white is a decrease of 5% or more. The dark blue is an increase of 15% or more. So it's very obvious that elementary and secondary enrollment in areas that were traditionally heavily Catholic areas, the upper Midwest and the Northeast, are places where there simply aren't as many kids. So that's the first demographic change. The geographic center of the Catholic Church is shifting south also. So if you look between 1972 and 2016, 41% of the Catholics were in the Northeast in 1972, 26% in 2016, 28% in the Midwest, 1972 to 20% in 2016. And look at the whopping growth in the South, 13% to 29%, in the West also, but less dramatic, 18% to 25%. Back in the mid-2000s, the CARA, the Center for Applied Research on the Apostolate of Georgetown, did a study of Catholic elementary schools. And one of the things they said, which is telling, right? People move, schools don't. So that demographic issue. Also, you know, the movement in many dioceses, I mean, the history of Catholics is a history of urban America, and with the upward mobility of many Catholics, excluding the immigrants who don't have that kind of same upward mobility, but the immigrants of generation, 2-3 generations ago, that movement out of the urban core to the suburbs, to the exurbs, and in rural areas too. So, not only is there shifting populations geographically, but also a change in the percent of population. If you look here at racial categories, you can see the growth of people of color. We will become a majority minority country by 2065, and I think, in fact, the movement, now, with immigration issues at the moment, who knows, but clearly it's not the same white America it was in 1965, and you can see that clearly. The Catholic Church experiences that ethnic transformation too. So 25 years ago, 87% of Catholics were white, non-Hispanic, compared to 55% today. Fewer than 4 in 10, 36% of Catholics under the age of 30 are white today. 52% are Hispanic. So you can see here the graph that illustrates quite dramatically the decline of white non-Hispanics by percent. And so the younger you are, the less likely you are to be white non-Hispanic. The youngest group, Generation Z, would be 60% Hispanic. And you know, in many ways, I think we have failed that population in the Catholic school network. Okay, so what's some of the impact of these demographic changes, the predictions of the federal government that public elementary and secondary schools nationally will increase, and you think back to that map, the dark blue places. Enrollment in private and elementary and secondary schools will decrease 13% between 20 and 2013, and they predict 6% between 2013 and 2025. It wouldn't surprise me if that is even higher. Okay, so what we have now is an educational marketplace where people make choices that they didn't exist before. And so a charter school, before 1991, there was no such thing. It's a publicly funded school, not under the jurisdiction of the local education authority. Homeschooling, another option, a growing sector. District schools, and one of the things that we'll see about district schools, you know, at one time, if you had a catchment area, it was really district schools and private schools, right? So you had the option of going to your local public school, which is geographically based. You had a captured population, or private school was the other option. That's no longer the case. So as a result, people are looking at issues of cost, evidence of quality in terms of making their choice, thinking of the long-term career goals. A lot of skepticism these days about everyone going to a four-year college. Return on investment is another aspect of this consumer mentality in regard to schools. And people look at value, but they also look at values, which is one kind of niche area, I think, even though charter schools would claim, many of them, to have a kind of philosophy quite similar to the Catholic philosophy. Okay, so grading schools. Report cards are not just for students anymore. We have these array of tests. These are nationwide tests and international assessments. We also have various state assessments. Catholic schools in some states participate in the state assessment, as they do in New York. In other states like Massachusetts, they are forbidden by law to participate in the state testing system. But we look at SAT scores and we look at other kinds of evidence of quality. I've heard a number of people in schools, especially public schools, saying, if only we could spend less time testing and more time teaching. But we are in a very much an assessment testing mode that, again, people look for evidence of the quality, academic quality of the school by the test scores of students. In many ways, then, we get a number. We grade schools, right? It's like buying a car. It's like a consumer report of buying a good, education as a commodity. And so where do Catholic schools fit into that? Well, one of the big issues with Catholic schools, of course, is sticker shock. It's for private education generally at every level, from preschool, which actually many preschools are very expensive, all the way up through graduate school, as you know well, given the tuition levels at Fordham. Now, in many cases, as in your case, right, there is a reduction in tuition through scholarships, right, that we try to make private education, Catholic education, available. And so one of the key features is the discount rate, So, for example, at Fordham University, for every dollar we charge in tuition, let's say on the undergraduate level, we would only we would discount 46% of that. So only 54% of what is charged because of the extent of financial aid. And of course, in Catholic schools, you wish it would be 100%, but that's just not feasible. Having said that, the availability, so for example, people look at figures of the tuition that it costs at a Catholic high school versus nothing in the public school. Even though there is financial aid, but people see that price, right? And the public option looks pretty good. People, as you know, are very afraid of debt. There is more student loan debt now than credit card debt in the United States. And especially if you start private education at an early age and go all the way through graduate school, along with your diploma, you will have whopping debts to pay. And that question of return on investment, is it worth it? I might really want to send my kid to the local Catholic school, but, if I have a couple kids, if I stay in private education from preschool to university, that's going to cost me close to $500,000. And we have, in many ways, I think the middle class is declining with the changing economic landscape, even though the economy is pretty hot these days, but the data do show the growing gap. And in many ways, when we look at the traditional clientele in Catholic schools, they were people from the middle class, the daughters and sons of teachers and nurses and cops and what have you. So socioeconomic status is an important issue. In some ways, I think, in Catholic schools, we have the Scylla and Charybdis, right? Rock and a hard place choice. Elitism, if you can garner enough interest of full-paying people, or extinction, and trying to find some middle ground. The crucial point is, how do you increase significantly the amount of non-tuition income? And in many Catholic schools, tuition would count for 70, 80, 90% of your income. Okay. As I said, it becomes increasingly difficult given the shrinking middle class. These are long-term data. Who knows with the current hot economy where that will go, but certainly these are some of the issues of affordability, right? And the number of people living in middle-income households is falling, and I mentioned that. Okay, so what about government funding? Again, as I mentioned, right, we're looking for non-tuition income. Private philanthropy, of course, is a big piece of that, but also looking at issues related to church and state. It is interesting that the interpretation of that wall of separation is interpreted differently. So Catholic healthcare or Catholic charities or Catholic universities can receive government money, but elementary and secondary schools or Catholic day schools, preschools can, but K-12, no. So people look at issues related to vouchers, where parents are given money to send their kids to whatever school they would like of their choice. In some states, there is voucher legislation. Interestingly, in the places that are traditionally heavily Catholic, the upper Midwest and the Northeast, politically vouchers would be, in my estimation, pretty impossible. Tax credits for people who send their kid to private schools is a less, it is more acceptable in the eyes of many people. And that, Pennsylvania, for example, has tax credits, and that can make a big difference. Title funds, that the eligibility of not so much funding schools, but funding children in Catholic schools in regard to things like special education. Also, certain title funds available for professional development of teachers. In some states, varies from place to place. Textbooks and other curriculum materials can be provided via the local education authority. Likewise, transportation and buses differs from, we have 50 school systems, right? 50 different states. E-rate reduction is also a federal program to try to deal with the digital divide issue. Many Catholic schools can participate in that. Farm programs, free and reduced meals, breakfast and lunch for children, and that is actually regulated through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and that is accessible. Again, it's not funding schools, but it's funding children in schools. But the number of regulatory requirements that come along with that, the issue related to hiring in terms of acceptance of kids. Can you have a preference for Catholics and hiring in a Catholic school? A rabbi friend of mine once said, and I think it's really true, with the shekels come the shackles. So looking at that. Issue of testing, we talked about that a little bit, varies from state to state. The Affordable Care Act provisions, which as you know, have undergone great shifts, but in terms of Catholic institutions needing to provide contraception or abortion funding. HR discrimination issues, the question related to morality clauses in contracts and their legal standing. So people who are either vocal opponents of church teaching or living in a way inconsistent with church teaching. What's going to happen with the IRS tax code on charitable donations? And that's an issue. At least at one point, there was a big fight for provisions related to the tax bill that passed last year with the private higher ed community, because there was going to be a real negative effect on the ability to have a credit for charitable donations. Pilot is another issue. Pilot, I'm not talking about airplanes. It is payment in lieu of taxes that some cities are requiring of private schools. And if you have police protection, if you have fire protection, well, if you participate in municipal services, you should pay taxes like everyone else. And again, as you'll see in the lecture down the road, with the decline of religious interest, adherence, and identity, these things are likely to become even more so. And then finally, Blaine Amendments. These are amendments to state constitutions that explicitly prohibit funding to Catholic schools. Comes out of the mid-19th century anti-Catholic movement, and a number of states, 30 plus states, have those amendments. So in order to directly fund Catholic schools in a place like New York, you would have to have an amendment to the state constitution. And we know how difficult politically that would be. So as a result, when we look at this competitive marketplace, here we have the stats. Take a look at them. I think pretty obviously the trend lines very different than the trend line, for example, of charter schools, right? So if you look at 1,835 students in 6,352 Catholic schools, we have approximately 3 million, over 3 million kids in charter schools and nearly 7,000 charter schools. So, if you were predicting, you'd say, well, Catholic schools are dying and charter schools are replacing them. If we look at where charter schools are, they tend to be in urban centers, which is where Catholic schools tend to be more heavily. And you can see some cities, for example, and you can see the growth. Cities like, over 33% of kids in the Philadelphia school district are in charter schools. And how many of them would have been in Catholic schools in a place like Philly that had such a large and extensive Catholic school system? Not so much in New York, as you can see. New York is a bit different, but also a place like Chicago, heavily Catholic, and then some of the cities in the South, LA, San Antonio, LA, Houston, Phoenix, San Diego, very heavily Latino too. And to what extent are those young Latino kids in charter schools, not in Catholic schools? Homeschooling. Now, homeschooling is another situation where there's been tremendous growth. The estimate is 3 decades ago, homeschooling was illegal in 30 states. Today, it is legal everywhere. It's the fastest growing form of education in America. You can see those statistics from 1975 to 2018. And you can see, if you look at the graph itself, the map, the level of regulation about homeschooling. Why do people homeschool? This is what people have answered. Dissatisfaction with academics, but heavily dissatisfied, concerned about the environment of public or other schools, moral instruction, religious education, etc. And of course, in the Catholic world, there is Catholic homeschooling. People who, by and large, are skeptical around the orthodoxy of traditional Catholic schools. So all of this creates a very complicated competitive environment. Why don't kids attend Catholic school? This is a study, and it'd be interesting to actually do a study, a follow-up study. Easier to deal with parents in Catholic schools than those who aren't in Catholic schools, but in any event. Affordability, not surprising at all. Lack of religious Catholic commitment on the part of the family, right? So it used to be, it's worth paying the price because I want the kid in a religious environment. Well, yes, for some people that is still the case, but a decreasing number of people. Educate ROI, return on investment, the 19%. People question educational value for the price paid. And then we do know, of course, that many Catholic schools cannot provide the kind of adequate education for kids with special needs, even though they try to work through the local district, but that inclusion of special needs kids. So, what will the world look like in 2050? All the kids sitting in your school will be at leadership in 2050. Interesting, all these kinds of, if you just kind of go on the web and you find these images of what the world in 2050 will be like. And so, in 32 years, what will the world look like? In some ways, I think you'll have an increasing variety variety of issues, but you will find district schools becoming increasingly, over the time, looking at the future, increasingly aggressive. Every public school superintendent wants a kid in your school. And so as a result, I directed a dissertation at Boston, at Boston College, that looked at, it was talking to superintendents about how charter schools have changed their district policy and priorities. One of the big issues was increased advertising, increased marketing. Likewise, charter schools do their own marketing. Private schools do marketing, and sadly, sometimes there are Catholic schools that compete with each other. I know that's hard to believe. And then, you also have customized education. And again, this will be available not only as this talk here, but as a PowerPoint itself. You can click that on, and it's really interesting. It's a TV spot talking about an online public school. In some ways, I think Catholic schools are terrific, but are we still looking at building Instamatic cameras in very traditional schools that are not the best way to prepare for young people for the world of 2050? This image comes to me from, I was on the board at Loyola University in New Orleans, and we were looking at how to become more market successful. And one of the trustees had been in Rochester and said, Kodak saw the digital revolution coming, but they continued to build Instamatic. So I guess the question for us, are we still building Instamatic cameras in a world that is increasingly competitive, an educational marketplace where we have to be important players? And that's hard to do. And you'll read that chapter that I wrote on leadership. Why is change so hard? Well, why do we continue making Instamatics? We have an emotional attachment to the status quo. We have a lack of current knowledge about the current reality in many cases. People live in denial of the need for change. A lack of imagination about possible futures. Again, education preparing people for leadership in 2050. That takes a lot of imagination. And people are insecure about the future. And when they're insecure, they tend to circle the wagons and continue doing the same thing with less and less success. So, the change issue and strategic planning issue, how do you realistically understand and deal with consumer demand and mission, and where do you find that sweet spot that doesn't abandon your mission in order to meet consumer demand, but it also is realistic about sustainability and viability. Okay, so hope you've enjoyed the lecture. Hope you found it informative, and look forward to seeing your discussions.